The wind was whipping the snow drifting through the deserted streets of Cheyenne when Caden Frost felt her perfect life begin to crumble for the first time. She stood at the panoramic window of her and Griffin's house, looking out at the snow-capped mountain peaks on the horizon. 10 years ago, she'd never imagined she'd end up here, a successful woman from Oklahoma City, married to one of Wyoming's most promising businessmen. Their meeting with Griffin was like a scene from a romantic movie. A real estate conference in Denver, an accidental coffee spill, an apology, and dinner to make up for it. Caden, then an aspiring accountant, had been charmed by the charismatic owner of the construction company. Griffin knew how to charm, tall, with a shrewd look in his gray eyes, and that special self-confidence of people who were used to getting their way. 6 months later, she moved to Cheyenne, and a year later they were married. Her career was going well, a large accounting firm, a stable income, the respect of colleagues. Griffin's business flourished. His company, Frost Construction, became one of the leading companies in the state. They bought a house in an upscale neighborhood and planned to have children. That's why the news of Avery's move to Cheyenne took Caden by surprise. Her half-sister had never shown an interest in small towns, preferring the vibrant life of Los Angeles. But now she had decided to open a designer clothing boutique here. "Caden, honey, this is a great opportunity to be closer to each other." Avery's voice over the phone sounded enthusiastic. "Plus, the market here is totally free. Can you believe it? Not a single decent designer clothing store." Caden remembered Avery very young. Her father had married her mother when Avery was only 12. Now she had grown into a successful businesswoman whose first boutique in Los Angeles had become popular with local celebrities. Griffin took the news with enthusiasm. "It's a great idea. I'll help pick out the space. I have connections," he said over dinner, carefully avoiding his wife's gaze. That evening was the first time Caden noticed the change in the timbre of his voice at the mention of Avery. She put it down to fatigue. The last few months had been stressful, Griffin working on a major project. Avery had arrived in early spring, before the last of the snow had melted. She brought with her the smell of expensive perfume, California sunshine, and something else, elusive, that made Caden feel uncomfortable in her own home for the first time in years. "This will be a new phase in my life," Avery said at the family dinner, raising her wine glass. Her green eyes glittered in the chandelier light, and Griffin stared at her a little longer than he should have looked at his wife's half-sister. It was a cool spring in Cheyenne. Caden watched workers install a Parker sign over the entrance to Avery's new boutique in the historic downtown area. Exquisite gold letters on a black background, all in the style of her half-sister, who always knew how to impress. Their relationship had never been easy. When her father had brought a new wife into the house with a beautiful green-eyed daughter, 15-year-old Caden had felt betrayed. Avery was younger, brighter, more attractive. She charmed everyone around her with her spontaneity and ability to be the center of attention. "You know, I've always been jealous of your determination," Avery confided unexpectedly as they looked at the boutique space together. "You always knew exactly what you wanted." Caden remained silent. She remembered how in high school Avery had dated a guy she liked, how at prom everyone admired Avery's dress while her own looked too plain, how her father praised his younger daughter's accomplishments more often than not, as if he'd forgotten her older daughter existed. Griffin spent more and more time with Avery, helping with repairs and paperwork. "It's just business, honey," he'd say, coming home later and later. He smelled like an unfamiliar perfume, but Caden convinced herself it was just the scent of a new boutique. Their own evenings grew quieter. Griffin was staying late at work more and more often, and when he got home, he was immersed in his phone or laptop. Dinners together had become a silent ritual, where everyone was thinking about something else. "You've changed," Caden once said. "It's all work. Big project," he replied, not lifting his eyes from his phone screen. The opening of the boutique turned into the event of the year for Cheyenne. Avery had invited fashion bloggers from Denver, organized a buffet and a fashion show of designer collections. Caden watched her half-sister flit between guests in a dress that emphasized every curve of her figure. Griffin hadn't left her side all evening, introducing her to important clients. "We make a great team," Avery said, raising her glass of champagne. At that moment, Caden noticed Griffin's fingers lingering on her sister's waist for a second. After the opening, life flowed with a new rhythm. The boutique quickly became popular with the local elite. Avery often called Griffin for advice on business matters. He always picked up the phone, even if he hadn't returned his wife's calls before. One evening, Caden found an old photo album. In one of the pictures, she and Avery were standing in an embrace at her father's graduation. He was receiving an honorary award at his construction company. They were smiling, but Caden remembered how she'd felt that day. The same way she felt now that her place in this family was slowly being taken by someone else. It had been a hot June. Caden woke up at night from the heat and often found half the bed empty, Griffin working late on a new project. On her husband's nightstand, the phone was now always on the bedside table, screen down. That evening, she stayed late at the office, going over quarterly reports. Called her husband to warn him she'd be late. "I'll be late too, honey. Important meeting with the contractors." His voice sounded normal. The city was buzzing in the background. Driving past Avery's boutique, Caden noticed lights in the windows. Odd, usually the store closed at 7. Parking in front of the house at 10 p.m., she saw Griffin get out of his car. He smelled like expensive perfume, but not the kind she'd given him. "Rough day?" Caden asked. "Yeah, had to tour a few sites." He kissed her cheek and went upstairs. The next day at the family dinner, Avery talked about the problems with the vendors. Griffin listened intently, occasionally throwing in a piece of advice. Maybe it showed, but his hand lingered on the back of her chair a little longer than usual. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Avery smiled. "You're a real lifesaver." Caden noticed that her husband started checking his phone more often. Sometimes he would go out on the balcony to talk. "Work calls," he explained. One day she happened to hear the end of the conversation. "Yes, sure. Same time tomorrow." In the evenings, Griffin often lingered in his office. When Caden came in, he'd quickly switch tabs on his browser. "Just estimates," he'd say, but his gaze remained intense. At their favorite restaurant, the waitress looked at them in surprise. "And I thought you were here yesterday, Mr. Frost." Griffin replied that she was mistaken, but the tips of his ears turned red, a sure sign that he was nervous. Avery started showing up at their house more often. Always impeccably dressed with a new haircut, she brought with her an air of easy flirtation. "You don't mind if I consult with Griffin about expanding the boutique, do you?" she asked her sister. One morning, Caden found a check from the coffee shop for 2 cups of cappuccino in her husband's jacket pocket. Griffin didn't drink cappuccinos, just black coffee. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe it was just paranoia. But a worm of doubt had already settled somewhere deep inside. Caden began to notice details that had seemed insignificant before. The new shirt she hadn't bought, the faint smell of perfume in the car, the long glances across the table at family dinners. Her phone jingled, a message from Avery. "Sis, long time no see. How about dinner for the 3 of us this weekend?" Caden looked at the screen. It was business as usual, almost business as usual. The discovery had come unexpectedly, like a summer thunderstorm in Wyoming. Caden had planned a surprise wedding anniversary that day, made reservations at their favorite restaurant in Denver, called Griffin's secretary to cancel all appointments for Friday night. "But Mr. Frost doesn't have any appointments for Friday," Martha sounded surprised in her voice. "He took the night off, said he was going to a construction site in Laramie." Laramie. That's where Avery said a branch of her boutique was opening. Thursday night, Griffin was packing a business travel bag. "It's just for the day, honey. I'll be back on Saturday." He seemed distracted, avoided making eye contact. Friday morning, Caden got in her car and drove to Laramie. 3 hours into the drive, she rehearsed the conversation with her husband, convincing herself that everything could be explained. The construction site really could exist. Avery really could have opened a boutique there. The town greeted her with sunshine and a cool breeze. She parked outside the only decent hotel, the Mountain View Resort. Avery's Range Rover was parked in the parking lot. The receptionist appeared talkative. Of course, Mr. and Mrs. Frost, 7th floor suite, a lovely couple. Caden didn't remember getting to the 7th floor. It was pounding in his head, Mrs. Frost. Avery introduced herself as his wife. Her half-sister had given her name. Their voices she heard from behind the suite door. Avery's laughter, Griffin's low voice, the familiar sound of a champagne bottle being uncorked. Caden turned and walked toward the elevator. In the hotel lobby, she threw up. She drove to Cheyenne on autopilot, stopping every hour to take a sip of water. At home, she pulled out all the paperwork Griffin had signed over the last few months. Transfers to Avery's company accounts, lease agreements for the premises, impressive sums spent as consulting services. On Saturday, she waited for them to return. Griffin arrived first, sunburned, with a story about complicated negotiations. Avery showed up 2 hours later, looking like she'd just returned from Denver. "We need to talk." Caden invited her sister to coffee at a small downtown coffee shop. Avery looked flawless. A new dress, jewelry that Caden had never seen before. "What do you want to talk about, sis?" "I know everything. About Laramie, about the hotel, about how you introduced yourself with my name." Avery's face changed. Gone was the usual smile, and there was a cold glint in his eyes. "So what are you going to do? Tell my father. Show the money transfer documents to the IRS. Ruin your reputation the way you ruined my marriage." Avery leaned closer. "Think carefully, Caden. Griffin has dirt on you too. Remember those documents you signed without looking? There's some interesting points in there about tax evasion." "You're bluffing. Shall we check it out? Griffin's got it all covered. He's a smart man. That's why I chose him." Caden felt her fingers go numb. "How long ago?" "What does it matter? The important thing is that he's mine now. And you've always been too proper, too boring. He deserves better than that. I could destroy you both. And we can destroy you. So I propose a peaceful solution. You keep quiet, we go on as we were. Only now you know the rules of the game." Caden stood up from the table. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained calm. "You're wrong to think you know me, sis. I'll give you a week. And then I'll spring into action." She stepped outside. The July sun was blinding her eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a thunderstorm was gathering, heavy clouds creeping in from the mountains. Caden pulled out her cell phone and dialed her lawyer's number. The game had indeed begun, but the rules would be hers. The last week of July was sweltering. A thunderstorm that had been brewing for days never broke, leaving the town in sticky anticipation. That evening, they gathered at the Frost's house. Caden had insisted on this meeting. "We need to discuss things in a civilized manner," she told Griffin over the phone. He agreed reluctantly, but he had no choice. Her ultimatum left no room for maneuver. Avery arrived first, wearing a black silk dress and carrying a bottle of wine. "Last family dinner?" she asked with that peculiar smile Caden had always hated. Griffin showed up half an hour later. His face had grown gaunt over the past week, shadows lingering under his eyes. He brought with him a briefcase full of documents, proof of his version of events. "I filed the paperwork with the IRS." Caden placed a folder of papers on the table. "They're going to start the audit tomorrow." "You wouldn't dare," Griffin stepped forward. "It would destroy the company." "Already dared, and not just that." Avery went pale as Caden pulled out a second envelope. "I found camera footage in Laramie, and witnesses. Lots of witnesses. You do realize that we could also—" Avery began. "You can, but I've got it all covered. If anything happens to me, the paperwork will automatically go to the proper authorities." They parted ways around 9. Griffin drove off first, slamming the car door. Avery lingered on the porch. "You realize he never really loved you, don't you?" Her words hung in the stuffy air. Caden closed the door silently. At 11 o'clock, a car pulled up to Avery's house. The light in the living room was on. She was waiting for someone. A figure in dark clothes stepped up onto the porch. The door opened. A thunderstorm finally broke around midnight. Lightning illuminated the empty streets of Cheyenne, thunder blocking out all other sounds. Avery's body was found in the morning. She was lying at the foot of the stairs leading to the second floor. Investigators found evidence of a struggle in the living room. An overturned table, a broken vase, palm prints on the wall. There were dark bloodstains on the carpet. Detectives Sloan Ramirez and Waylon Turner arrived on the scene at 7 a.m. They examined the body, recorded the position of the objects, and interviewed the first witnesses. "Looks like a crime of passion," Turner remarked, examining the broken mirror in the hallway. Ramirez remained silent. She stared at the wall clock, which had stopped at 11:42, the time of death, the time when someone's hatred proved stronger than reason. An envelope of papers lay on the coffee table. The edges were stained with blood. It looked like the killer was looking for something specific. The storm had subsided, leaving behind damp air and fallen trees. A new day was beginning that would forever change the lives of everyone involved in this story. No one worked with the body until the detectives arrived. The police cordoned off the house and garden, waiting for specialists. At 8:30 in the morning, Sloan Ramirez and Waylon Turner went up to the porch of Avery Parker's house. The mailman was the first to find the body, the patrol officer reported. 6:30. Saw the door ajar, called out to the landlady. When no one answered, looked inside. Ramirez pulled on her gloves and entered the house. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, cutting the living room into swaths of light and shadow. Overturned furniture, shattered vases, bloodstains on the light-colored carpet all told of a violent struggle. Judging by rigor mortis, death occurred between 11 and 12 at night. The CSI looked up from the body. Multiple blunt force trauma to the head and upper torso. The killer was in a rage. Turner crouched next to the broken mirror. There are prints here, and traces of blood on the shards. Maybe the killer hurt himself. There were 2 glasses on the kitchen table. One held the remains of red wine, the other untouched. Ramirez ran her finger over the fogged surface, which meant the ice had melted recently. The victim was waiting for someone, she said, and that someone came. By 10 o'clock, the entire forensics team was at the house, photographing footprints, collecting samples, looking for prints. They found a safe on the 2nd floor, open, with documents scattered about. We need to question the sister and brother-in-law. Turner reviewed the notes in his notebook. Uniforms already went to their house. Caden Frost is home. Husband's at work. Ramirez nodded. We'll start with the sister. Have her at the station by 2 o'clock. In the interrogation room, Caden looked calm. Too calm for someone learning of her sister's death. Where were you last night between 11 and 12 at night? At home. Took a bath, then read. I took a sleeping pill around midnight and went to bed. Can anyone corroborate your alibi? No. My husband didn't come home last night. Said he had an important meeting in Denver and would stay there. When was the last time you saw your sister? Last night. The 3 of us went out, me, Avery, and Griffin. We had a difficult conversation. About what? About money, about business, about betrayal? Turner glanced over to Ramirez. Betrayal? I think you should talk to my husband. He'll be able to explain a lot of things. At 4 o'clock, Griffin Frost sat in the same office. Crumpled suit, red eyes. It looked like he'd really spent the night on the road. I was in Denver, spent the night at the Hilton Hotel. You can check it out. We'll be sure to check. Ramirez placed a picture of 2 glasses in front of him. Who was Avery expecting last night? I have no idea. After our meeting, I left for Denver right away. And what was the meeting about? Griffin was silent for a moment. Look, Avery and I had a business relationship, some financial arrangements. Caden found out about it and threatened to go to the IRS. Only business? He looked away. Business only. By evening, the detectives had a folder of evidence, fingerprints, blood samples, crime scene photos, and 2 versions of events that contradicted each other. What do you think? Turner asked when they were alone. Ramirez was looking at a family photo found in the murdered woman's purse. I think that when it comes to money, love, and revenge, only the dead man knows the truth. Detective Ramirez sat at her desk, studying the witness statements. Crime scene photos lay in front of her, but her gaze returned again and again to a family snapshot from 3 months ago. Caden, Griffin, and Avery at the boutique opening. I have an update from Laramie. Turner placed the folder in front of her. The hotel receptionist identified them. Avery and Griffin have stayed there 5 times in the last 2 months. Like a regular couple? More than average. Had dinner at a restaurant, walked around town. No one would have thought she was his wife's sister. Mrs. Hendricks, a former accountant for Frost Construction, gave unexpected details under questioning. It all started about a year ago. Griffin insisted that his wife stop doing the bookkeeping for the company, said she needed to concentrate on her work at her firm, And then those weird contracts with Avery's boutique started. What kind of contracts? Consulting, market research, everything looked official, but the sums were huge. No boutique is worth that kind of money. By evening, the forensic report was on Ramirez's desk. 2 types of blood were found on the mirror shards. One belonged to the victim. The second sample was still being tested. You know what's weird? Turner was looking at the crime scene photos. Judging by the footprints, there were 2 of them. One person attacked her from behind, the other stood at the door. A neighbor, Mrs. Bloom, completed the picture. I saw 2 cars that night. First came a black Mercedes, like Mr. Frost's. Then, about 20 minutes later, a dark Jeep showed up, and they left in reverse order. Under repeated questioning, Caden held herself calm, but the fingers clutching the cup of water were visibly trembling. I began to suspect back in the spring. Griffin had changed. He started staying late at work. There were some urgent business trips. And then I saw them together at a restaurant in Laramie. It was a coincidence. I was visiting a client. Why didn't you file for divorce? You don't understand. This isn't just about infidelity. I checked the company records. They were withdrawing money through Avery's boutique. Millions of dollars. That evening, Ramirez stared at the evidence board for a long time. A love triangle, financial fraud, jealousy, greed, all woven into a tight knot. We're missing something, Turner said. Something important. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. A young officer brought the printouts of Avery's phone calls for the last month. Here it is. Ramirez circled one number in red. She called a private investigator every day for the last week before she died. You think she was checking up on someone? Or afraid? So much so that she hired protection. Detective Jenkins's tired voice came through the phone. Yes, Avery Parker was a client of mine. She asked me to follow 2 people, said she was afraid for her life. Who did she ask you to follow? Her sister and her lover. She didn't seem to trust either of them. Ramirez hung up the phone and looked at Turner. Looks like our victim was running her own game, and clearly knew more than we thought. Ramirez spread the crime scene photos on the table. The broken mirror, the traces of blood on the carpet, the overturned table, the smudged palm prints on the wall. 2 weeks of painstaking investigation reduced the crime scene to 3 key clues. The first was the calls to the private investigator. After the murder, Jenkins came to the police himself. His report showed that Avery had started following her sister and husband as early as a month ago. She was especially interested in their private meetings. She suspected some kind of conspiracy. Jenkins's file contained dozens of photos. Caden leaving the bank with a folder of documents, Griffin handing her an envelope at a coffee shop, their long conversation in the car outside the IRS office. The second piece of evidence was a blood sample from Avery's house. The lab confirmed. In addition to the victim's blood, they found traces of Caden Frost's blood on the mirror shards and door jamb. The cuts on her hands seen at the time of her arrest matched the nature of the injuries. The third piece of evidence came from a neighbor, an elderly Mrs. Bloom, who suffered from insomnia. On the night of the murder, she saw 2 cars from her window. Griffin's black Mercedes showed up at 11:30. 20 minutes later, Caden's Jeep pulled up. At 1:30 they left 10 minutes apart. First the Mercedes, then the Jeep. The experts placed the time of death between 11 and 12 o'clock. Griffin's testimony at first did not agree with this time, but on re-examination he changed his version. Yes, he went to Avery's house. Yeah, Caden was there. They talked about money, about the company, about a possible scandal. Avery threatened to go to the IRS. He tried to negotiate, offered a compromise. Then he left, leaving the sisters alone. Caden had to change her statement too. She admitted that she visited her sister, that they had an argument, cut her hand on a mirror shard during the confrontation, insisted that Avery was alive when she left, but surveillance cameras showed otherwise. Her Jeep left the neighborhood 10 minutes later than Griffin's Mercedes. When Ramirez showed her the footage, fear flashed in Caden's eyes. She immediately demanded a lawyer. The medical examiner's report painted a picture of a violent attack. Multiple blunt force trauma suggests a state of passion. The perpetrator didn't act in cold blood. He was driven by blind rage. The final piece of the puzzle was Avery's call to Detective Jenkins minutes before his death. 30 seconds of desperate screaming about the will, about how her sister had known everything from the beginning. Then the connection cut off. Looking at the evidence board, Ramirez saw the full picture of the crime taking shape. The story of love and revenge had its final chord. In the morning, she placed the indictment folder on the lieutenant's desk with the killer's name underlined in red marker. A few hours later, the prosecutor signed the arrest warrant. The interrogation room looked uncomfortable in the early morning light. Ramirez placed the crime scene photos on the table. Caden Frost stared at them without looking away. She'd been in the holding cell for 3 days, but she looked like she hadn't slept in forever. "Tell me what happened that night. The truth this time." "I came to talk to my sister. Griffin was already there." Caden's voice sounded muffled. "They were discussing their departure. Tickets to Europe, new papers, it was all set." "When did Griffin leave?" "Around 12. He didn't want to get involved in the scandal. Said he'd be back for Avery in the morning. You know, he didn't even look at me when he left. It was like I wasn't there." Caden looked up at the detective. "You know what she said to me when it was just the two of us? That she was always jealous of my life. That she seduced Griffin on purpose, just to prove she could. She laughed when she said it, laughed at 10 years of my marriage." "And you hit her?" "She was standing by the stairs, so beautiful in her black dress. Said I'd always been a naive fool, that Griffin never loved me, that all these years he'd just put up with me while he built his business." Ramirez waited silently for her to continue. "I pushed her, just wanted her to be quiet. She fell, hit her head on the steps, and then—" Caden covered her face with her hands. "I don't remember. I only remember the shards of the mirror, the blood on her hands, and her stopped gaze. I remember sitting next to her on the floor and kept trying to feel for a pulse." "Why didn't you call an ambulance?" "I knew she was dead. At some point I realized I was sitting in a pool of blood, my little sister. I killed my little sister. And then? Then I got in my car and drove home, took a shower, burned my clothes in the fireplace, and waited for them to come for me." In the hallway, Ramirez met Caden's lawyer. "Will she sign a confession?" "Yes. We'll push for a crime of passion. The prosecutor is agreeing to the plea deal." An hour later, Ramirez emerged from the interrogation room with a signed confession. Turner was waiting in the hallway. "She confessed?" "Yes, a crime of passion. The prosecutor will ask for manslaughter." "Does Griffin know?" "His lawyer will let us know, but I think he had a hunch. That's why he insisted on his alibi in Denver." That evening, they were closing the case. All the evidence fit: blood traces, witness statements, confessions. A story of love and jealousy ended in tragedy. "You know what the worst part is?" Turner asked, gathering the documents. All 3 of them genuinely believed the truth was on their side. "There's no right in these cases," Ramirez replied. "There are only victims, all 3 of them." She closed the last folder. The photo from the boutique opening remained on the table. 3 smiling faces, not yet knowing how it would end. Not yet knowing that their fates were already sealed even then. "Sometimes I think," Ramirez said as she put the photo away, "that the worst crimes aren't committed for money or revenge, but because of love that has turned into hate." The trial began in October, when the first frost had already chained the streets of Cheyenne. The courtroom was full. The high-profile case had captured the attention of the entire city. Caden Frost, pale and gaunt, sat next to her lawyer, staring straight ahead. The prosecutor presented the jury with a clear picture of events: a deliberate trip to her sister's house, an argument, a push at the stairs, and then several blows in a state of passion. The medical examiner's report confirmed that the first blow during the fall may have been accidental, but the subsequent blows were deliberate. Griffin testified on the second day. He looked aged and haggard. "Yes, Avery and I were having an affair. We planned to go away together. I did visit her that night, but I left before anything happened." "Why did you decide to leave your wife?" the prosecutor asked. "I thought I was in love with Avery. She was different. Everything seemed simpler with her, brighter. Now I realize I ruined the lives of everyone I cared about." The defense built on Caden's emotional state. Her attorney presented the jury with the story of a woman whose world collapsed overnight. Her husband cheated with her half-sister. They cheated together, withdrawing money from the company, planning an escape. Detective Ramirez spoke on the 4th day of the trial. Based on the evidence, This was not a premeditated murder. Mrs. Frost came to talk to her sister. The situation got out of hand after the victim's taunts. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Verdict: guilty of manslaughter. The judge sentenced Caden to 7 years in prison with parole eligibility in 4 years. After the trial, Ramirez met Griffin outside the courthouse. "What now?" she asked. "Selling the company. Leaving Cheyenne. Too many memories here." Avery's boutique closed. The windows were papered over. The sign was taken down. The house where the murder took place couldn't be sold for a long time because people shunned the place. A year later, Detective Ramirez happened to meet Mrs. Bloom at a supermarket. "You know," the older woman said, "I often think about them, about how one lie drags down another until it's too late to fix anything." In prison, Caden worked in the library. She didn't receive visitors or answer letters. Only once a month came a postcard from her father. No return address, just wishes to hang in there. Griffin moved to Seattle. A large construction holding company bought the company, and he transferred the money to a charity for victims of domestic violence. On her last day at work before Christmas, Ramirez was going through some old files. At the bottom of a drawer, she found the very same photo from the boutique opening. 3 smiling faces, 3 shattered destinies. "Sometimes the worst crimes aren't committed out of greed or malice," Turner said as she walked by. "It's because of a love that turned into an obsession." Ramirez tucked the photograph back into the folder. Outside the window, snow was falling, covering Cheyenne with a white blanket. The city was slowly forgetting this story, as it forgets any tragedy. But she knew. 3 people could never forget that July night when jealousy and betrayal had led to irreversible consequences. The case was closed. But its echo echoed long afterward in the quiet streets of Cheyenne, reminding her that sometimes the closest people can cause the worst pain.